June 6, 1944, Normandy. 14 hours. A thick layer of clouds drifts over the French countryside, blotting out moonlight and turning the landscape into a black, silent void. Inside a small German command post near Saint-Mère-Église, officers lean over a radio set, listening to routine coastal reports. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The night seems calm. Then faintly, almost imperceptibly, a distant vibration trembles through the air. Engines. Not one, not several. Dozens. The officers rush outside, scanning the sky, but they see only darkness. No lights, no silhouettes, only the low, growing roar of aircraft approaching from the west. Anti-aircraft crews aim blindly, firing bursts into the night, but their tracers disappear into emptiness. And then, without warning, the sky opens. Shadows fall from above, silent, countless, unseen until the last second. Parachutes blossom only when German flares ignite the fields, revealing American paratroopers dropping into hedgerows, orchards, and crossroads behind German lines. The officers freeze, horrified. The invasion has begun, and the Americans are literally falling out of the darkness. Nothing in German doctrine prepared them for this. Long before German officers found themselves staring into the darkness over Normandy, the concept of airborne warfare had already evolved into one of the most daring and unpredictable elements of World War II. The United States entered the conflict with no airborne divisions at all. Yet by 1944, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne had become highly trained, aggressively led formations capable of leaping into the night to seize objectives no conventional force could reach in time. The idea behind airborne assault was simple in theory and dangerous in execution. Deliver troops behind enemy lines before the enemy could react. But nighttime airborne operations remain among the riskiest tasks any army could attempt. Navigation was imprecise. Weather could scatter entire divisions. Pilots had only dim red lights inside their aircraft, no exterior illumination. And once paratroopers leaped into the dark, they had no guarantee of landing anywhere near their intended drop zones. Yet for the Normandy invasion, American planners knew they had no choice. The beaches were only one part of the assault. Without control of the causeways, bridges, and crossroads behind Utah Beach, the landings could fail before sunrise. Armored reinforcements needed open routes inland. The Germans needed to be cut off, confused, and delayed. Only airborne troops could do this in the critical first hours. German command, meanwhile, expected airborne landings, but not like this. Their doctrine assumed paratroopers would arrive at dawn or under bright moonlight, conditions that allowed pilots to navigate reliably and troops to organize after landing. They prepared flak positions around open field, expecting to see enemy formations descending clearly against the night sky. But their defenses had an overlooked weakness. Germany was not prepared for an assault delivered in complete darkness. Their radar coverage inland was thin. Their night fighters were few and poorly coordinated. Their communications networks suffered frequent delays. And many German officers believed a night drop was too chaotic for the Allies to risk. They were partly right. It was chaotic, but they underestimated how effectively the Americans had learned to turn chaos itself into a weapon. The American Airborne Divisions trained specifically for confusion. Commanders drilled their men to assemble quickly, adapt without orders, and fight independently. They learned to use the darkness, not fear it. General Matthew Ridgway of the 82nd told his officers repeatedly, scattered or not, "We will accomplish our mission." In contrast, German units relied heavily on centralized command and clear instructions. When communication broke, their ability to respond collapsed. Darkness multiplied this vulnerability. The Germans expected warning before an airborne attack. Instead, they received only the distant, growing hum of engines, and then the shock of paratroopers appearing where no one expected them. Normandy would prove the decisive test, where American airborne doctrine and German assumptions collided violently. In the black hours before dawn, as planning for Operation Overlord intensified. The airborne component, known as Operation Neptune, became one of the most meticulously structured yet inherently unpredictable missions of the entire invasion. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were to be dropped miles behind Utah Beach, securing causeways, seizing bridges, blocking German counterattacks, and sowing confusion throughout the Kotelnin Peninsula. But to accomplish these tasks, they needed to arrive unseen, unheard, and unanswered. That meant jumping in near total darkness. American planners understood the risk. The lessons from Sicily in 1943 haunted them. Friendly fire incidents, scattered landing, miscommunication, and panicked pilots. Dozens of paratroopers had drowned after being dropped offshore. Aircraft formations broke apart under stress, leaving units dispersed across entire regions. Yet, ironically, these failures taught the Allies the value of unpredictability. German defenders in Sicily were overwhelmed precisely because the drops were chaotic. The disorder made it impossible for enemy commanders to understand the scale or direction of the attack. Normandy would refine this lesson to guide the nighttime drops. The Allies employed pathfinders, small teams who jumped ahead of the main force. They carried Eureka beacons, which activated ground transmitters that worked with airborne Rebecca receivers inside C-47 transport aircraft. These signals helped pilots identify the correct drop zones in darkness, though wind, clouds, and flak sometimes disrupted the transmitters. Navigation remained perilous. Pilots flew under strict blackout conditions. No formation lights. No cockpit illumination. Only faint instrument glows and the silhouette of the aircraft ahead when cloud cover allowed. German radar posts detected aircraft but could not determine their number, altitude, or exact position. Their night fighter network was incomplete, their communications sluggish, and their searchlights oriented toward coastal bombardment rather than deep inland. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly, their tracers slicing the sky without clear targets. Meanwhile, the American Airborne Divisions were preparing mentally as much as physically. Training jumps simulated darkness, disorientation, and unexpected landing. Officers taught their men that scattering was not failure, but a tactical opportunity. Every soldier carried maps, compasses, clickers, and mission sheets to operate independently. Small groups could achieve objectives meant for entire companies. This resilience stood in stark contrast to the German mentality. The rigid structure of Wehrmacht units depended on rapid, centralized orders. If the chain of command fractured, especially at night, local units often froze, unsure whether to hold, withdraw, or counterattack. Reports from Normandy would later show that many German officers lost precious hours trying to verify airborne landings that were already unfolding around them. Operation Neptune's airborne phase turned the darkness into an ally. It hid the approach of hundreds of aircraft. It concealed the chaos of scattered landing. It amplified German uncertainty, creating an environment where every sound seemed threatening and every shadow potentially contained enemy troops. The Americans were not simply using the night, they were weaponizing it, and soon, German officers would learn just how devastating a weapon darkness could be. For the American paratroopers packed inside the rumbling C-47, the moments before the jump were unlike anything they had trained for. The interior lights glowed faint red, barely illuminating the faces around them. Outside the aircraft, the world was an empty, starless abyss. The men could not see the coastline, the ground, or even the shadows of neighboring planes. They felt only vibration, turbulence, and the sudden jolt of evasive maneuvers as pilots weaved through anti-aircraft fire. Many had jumped dozens of times in daylight. Few had ever leaped into complete darkness. As the green light approached, hearts pounded, voices lowered. Some whispered quick prayers. Some steadied their breathing. Others clenched their hands around the static line, bracing for the unknown. And the unknown was vast. No visual horizon, no sense of altitude, no idea whether the landing field was marsh, orchard, river, or enemy position. When the jump signal finally lit, men surged forward, disappearing into blackness. For several seconds, each paratrooper felt suspended in void, weightless, directionless, with nothing but the wind screaming past their helmets. The parachute opening was a violent, shocking relief, but it brought no clarity. Many looked down and still saw nothing. Some landed in hedgerows, some in flooded fields, others in the middle of German strongpoints, asterisk. But the overwhelming sensation shared by all was this. They had stepped into the night armed, only with courage and the hope that the darkness would hide them long enough to survive. German defensive doctrine rested on the assumption that visibility would determine the speed and accuracy of their response. Their anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and night patrols were designed to detect airborne landings early, allowing commanders to deploy reserves and counterattacks rapidly. But when the Americans dropped in total darkness, the German system fractured instantly from their command post. Officers heard engines stretching across miles of sky but could not identify direction or number. Their phones rang continuously, each call reporting different sightings, parachutes in orchards, gunshots in villages, shadows moving through fields. Some reports contradicted each other entirely. Others claimed hundreds of paratroopers were landing in multiple locations. Once thought this was not entirely wrong. The Americans were indeed scattered, but the Germans had no way of knowing which threats were real and which were illusions created by the night. Maps became useless, orders became guesses, and every moment of hesitation allowed the paratroopers to regroup, seize crossroads, and ambush responding units. What horrified German officers most was not the appearance of paratroopers themselves. They had trained for that. It was the silence with which they arrived. No pre-landing artillery. No visible formations. No horizon silhouettes. One officer later admitted, it felt as if the sky itself was dropping soldiers. Darkness had turned a disciplined army into a swarm of shadows. For the American Airborne Divisions, the darkness was not merely a condition, it was a tactical weapon. Scattered landings, far from being a disaster, generated widespread confusion that paralyzed the German response. Small groups of paratroopers emerged from hedgerows, ditches, and farm lanes in unpredictable directions. They ambushed convoys, seized bridges, cut telephone lines, and created the impression of a much larger force. Every German unit believed it was being surrounded. The darkness amplified the psychological impact. German soldiers fired at shapes they could not identify. Patrols stumbled into American squads entirely by accident. Officers struggled to establish defensive perimeters because they couldn't determine where the main attack was coming from. The Americans, meanwhile, adapted quickly. Their training emphasized improvisation, and the scattered drops allowed sergeants and lieutenants to take initiative. In several villages, isolated American squads seized crossroads before German reinforcements arrived. At causeways leading from Utah Beach, paratroopers held vital choke points for hours with only small groups. In the chaos, the Germans overestimated the airborne strength. Entire companies halted movement simply because a farmhouse had exchanged gunfire with unseen attackers. By dawn, the battlefield belonged to uncertainty, and uncertainty favored the Americans. The Germans expected order. The Americans brought chaos. And the darkness magnified it beyond anything German officers had imagined. The success of the nighttime airborne drops did not rely on bravery alone. It depended heavily on a suite of new technologies designed specifically to pierce the darkness, tools that the Germans neither possessed nor fully understood. At the heart of this system were the Rebecca, Eureka beacons, Pathfinder. Teams jumped minutes before the main force, landing in pitch-black fields under enemy fire. Their task was as critical as it was dangerous. Set up the Eureka transmitters, small radar-like devices that sent signals skyward. In the air, the transport planes carried Rebecca receivers, which detected the signal and guided pilots toward the intended drop zones. But the system was far from perfect. Clouds, wind, flak, miscommunication, and scattered landings made alignment difficult. Yet even partial guidance helped pilots deliver their paratroopers into the rough vicinity of their objectives. Other technologies also played key roles. Interior red lights preserved pilots' night vision. Formation flying techniques allowed hundreds of planes to fly in blackout conditions. Static lines and reserve chutes improved safety during blind jump. Clickers, crickets helped paratroopers identify one another in the darkness. German forces, by contrast, had no comparable tools. Their radar was limited, their night fighters few. Their searchlights oriented toward the beaches rather than inland. This technological imbalance meant that American aircraft penetrated deep behind German lines, with minimal detection. To German officers, it seemed as though the paratroopers had materialized out of thin air. In truth, it was the product of technology, planning, and thousands of hours of training, all converging in a moment when darkness became an allied ally. The chaos of the nighttime drops could easily have destroyed the mission. Units were dispersed across miles of countryside. Some paratroopers landed alone. Others fell into marshes, orchards, or even German Helltown. But what transformed disorder into advantage was leadership, not only at the top, but at every level of the Airborne Divisions. General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st Airborne embodied the airborne mindset. Take whatever action is necessary. When he landed nowhere near his intended assembly area, he simply gathered the men around him, from any company or battalion, and marched toward the nearest objective. His confidence became an anchor in the darkness. General Matthew Ridgway of the 82nd carried no rifle, only grenades. He believed officers should lead with presence, not firepower. His steady command during the drop's initial confusion kept morale intact. But the true brilliance was in the junior leaders, sergeants and lieutenants who understood that scattering was inevitable. They used their training to improvise ambush points, secure crossroads, and block German reinforcements. Decentralized command gave the Americans an enormous advantage. Isolated squads could still succeed independently. German units, by contrast, relied heavily on centralized orders. Without clear communication, they froze. Without visibility, they hesitated. Without leadership on the ground, they misinterpreted small skirmishes as large-scale attacks. Thus, the Americans exploited not just the terrain and darkness, but the rigid structure of the German command system itself. Disorder became strategy, scattering became infiltration, darkness became a force multiplier. Nighttime combat carries a unique terror. The senses warp, shadows move, sounds distort. A soldier cannot rely on sight, only instinct. German troops defending Normandy experienced this terror in full. When American paratroopers fell around them like phantoms from many German soldiers, the psychological blow was immediate. They expected airborne troops to arrive in visible waves, with clear formations and predictable landing zones. Instead, they heard aircraft overhead without seeing them. Then came distant shouts, scattered gunfire, and the unmistakable clicking of American crickets in hedgerows. Eerie markers of unseen enemies closing in. Reports flooded German command post. Paratroopers in the fields, paratroopers in the village, paratroopers behind us, paratroopers everywhere. Some of these sightings were real, Some were imagined, all contributed to a sense of encirclement for the Americans. The psychological burden was different but equally intense. Many jumped into complete uncertainty, unsure whether they would land alone in enemy territory. The darkness magnified their isolation, but it also protected them. German gunners fired blindly. Patrols stumbled into ambushes. And every American with a rifle became a psychological threat far larger than his actual presence. By dawn, both sides felt the psychological weight of the night. But only one side turned that weight into operational advantage. And for the Germans, the realization that the Americans had mastered the darkness was profoundly unsettling, a hint of the chaos and collapse that would soon consume their defenses. In Normandy, June 6, 1944, 0:48 hours. Above the Cotentin Peninsula, the armada of C-47 transport aircraft pushes inland through turbulent clouds. Anti-aircraft fire rising blindly from the earth below. Searchlights fail to find them. German flag burst illuminate nothing but vapor. To the officers in the German 709th and 243rd Infantry Divisions, the sky appears empty, but in the darkness above them, the American airborne invasion is beginning. Inside one of the lead aircraft, the jumpmaster shouts the final commands. The interior glows red. Men tighten their straps. Static lines hooked to the anchor cable. The open door reveals nothing, not fields, not rivers, not even horizon, only black. The aircraft shudders as its formation breaks apart under evasive maneuver. The green light flashes. Go, go, go. Paratroopers disappear into nothingness, swallowed by the night. Below, German sentries stationed near St. Mirag-Lys finally hear the growing roar of engines, dozens of them, approaching from multiple directions. Yet they still see no silhouettes against the sky. Their radios crackle with confused voices. A lieutenant demands to know the aircraft's altitude. Another insists it must be a reconnaissance flight. No one imagines thousands of American paratroopers are already descending above them, until parachutes bloom. A single German flare gun arcs upward, bathing the area in harsh white light. And in that brief illumination, the horror becomes visible. Hundreds of paratroopers falling silently into fields, orchards, gardens, and even the center of the town. At the church square of St. Mirag-Lys, villagers and German soldiers alike witness paratroopers landing unexpectedly, some dangling from trees and rooftops. A house fire lights the scene like a grotesque stage production. German officers shout for their men to open fire, but they cannot tell where the main drop is occurring. Paratroopers are scattered across miles. Every direction seems hostile. Meanwhile, isolated American groups gather as best they can. Some land in high hedgerows and cut themselves free. Others splash into flooded marshland, dropping ammunition to stay afloat. A few land directly amid German strong points and fight hand-to-hand in the dark. But despite the chaos, small American patrols begin to do exactly what their commanders intended: seize control of the causeways, the lifelines connecting Utah Beach to inland roads. At La Barquette Lock, a squad of only 15 men neutralizes a German defensive position, preventing the flooding of key landing zones. Near Poopville, paratroopers ambush an unsuspecting German column attempting to reinforce the beach defenses. Other groups capture bridges before demolition teams can destroy them. All of this happens before 2 o'clock. Inside a German field headquarters north of the Murder River, officers shout contradictory reports at one another. One claims an American battalion is advancing from the east. Another says only a few stragglers have landed. A third insists the paratroopers number in the thousands. None of them know the true scale, and that is precisely the problem. The Americans have not landed in a tight cluster. They have landed everywhere. And their presence spreads like wildfire through German lines. At St. Mirag-Lys, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krause's men, despite being scattered far off their intended drop zones, begin surrounding the town. By 4:30, they raise an American flag, making it the first town in France liberated on D-Day. The Germans are stunned. Their maps, their assumptions, their defensive plans, all rendered useless by an assault executed in near-perfect darkness, and the true scale of the crisis is only beginning to reveal itself. While the 101st Airborne was securing causeways and crossroads, the 82nd Airborne Division was fighting for survival along the Murder River, a landscape of marshes, fog banks, and drowned fields that swallowed entire squads in the darkness. Yet it was here, in some of the war's most disorienting terrain, that the German officers would experience their greatest shock. Shortly after 1:30 hour, the 82nd scattered companies landed across a vast, uneven region. Many paratroopers dropped miles from their intended zones, plunging into orchards, trees, flooded marshland, or the front yards of fortified farmhouses. The darkness made orientation nearly impossible. Some men wandered alone for hours, clicking their crickets and hoping to find comrades in the vast silence, but scattered or not, the 82nd was already achieving something extraordinary. They were everywhere. The Germans did not expect them to be. Lafayette Causeway, the critical choke point at the stone bridge near Lafayette. A handful of paratroopers held one of the most strategically critical positions in Normandy. If the Germans crossed here with armor or mechanized infantry, they could smash into the American beachhead at Utah. If the Americans held it, they cut off German reinforcements. Around 3 o'clock, German troops advancing toward the bridge encountered sporadic gunfire in the mist. They assumed it was a small patrol. Moments later, machine gun bursts erupted from hedgerows, and unseen soldiers opened fire from elevated ground. Paratroopers, scattered from multiple drop zones, had unknowingly converged at this vital point. The German officers were stunned. How could American troops be here already? How could they navigate marshland in darkness? How could scattered units form a defensive line so quickly? Chaos expands across the region. Reports poured into German command post. American paratroopers seen near Amfreville. Firefights erupting at Chef Dupont. Enemy infiltrating the hedgerows near Cockini bridges threatened from the west. Drowned fields echoing with gunfire at unpredictable intervals. Some of these reports concern as few as 5 Americans. Others involved entire companies. The Germans had no way to distinguish them. To frighten local commanders, every shadow seemed to contain enemy forces. Every farmhouse appeared compromised. As German battalion commanders attempted to deploy reinforcements, they faced roadblocks created not by large formations, but by small American groups firing from hedgerows, forcing whole columns to halt or retreat. Darkness magnified the effect tenfold. Psychological collapse in the ranks before 30. The situation reached a breaking point. German officers realized that the American paratroopers were not merely scattered, they were infiltrating, advancing, securing, blocking, ambushing. Every fresh report contradicted the last. Some German units believed they were surrounded when, in reality, only a handful of Americans were nearby. Others attempted counterattacks only to find the crossroads already fortified by paratroopers who had arrived hours earlier, men who should have been lost in the darkness but instead used it to their advantage. The Germans' worst fear crystallized in a single realization. The Americans had turned the night itself into a weapon. German officers understood the implication. Instantly, their defensive network was fractured. Their reinforcements were delayed. Their reports were unreliable. Their soldiers were terrified of unseen enemies. It was not a conventional assault. This was shock, multiplied by darkness, magnified by confusion. And by dawn, the German high command finally grasped the full scale of the catastrophe. The Americans were firmly behind their lines, not because they had landed perfectly, but because the chaos of the night had devastated German control. The airborne invasion, executed under conditions the Germans believed impossible, had succeeded. When dawn finally broke on June 6, 1944, the German officers who surveyed the battlefield faced a reality far worse than they had imagined. In the darkness, sunlight revealed what the night had concealed. American paratroopers scattered across miles of the Cotentin Peninsula, occupying hedgerows, villages, bridges, and crossroads with a presence that seemed impossibly widespread. To the Germans, it looked as though entire divisions had materialized behind their lines. In truth, it was only fragments, small squads, pairs, even lone paratroopers, but each group was acting with purpose, aggression, and initiative. And this was the heart of the crisis. The scattered drop that worked to wealth. Americans were never meant to land in such disorder. Clouds, flak, wind, and navigational errors had dispersed the 82nd and 101st over a vast area. Some planes dropped their sticks 6 miles off target. Others scattered their paratroopers into marshes or bocage far from planned objective. Yet instead of crippling the mission, the scattering produced exactly the kind of chaos the German command structure could not withstand. Small American groups cut telephone lines, severing German communication, blocked roads with hasty ambushes, captured critical bridges before demolition teams could act, confused German patrols with hit-and-run tactics, seized Saint-Mère-Église and key causeways, forced German reserves to deploy in the wrong directions. These created the illusion of a much larger force. German officers spent precious hours trying to identify where the main landing had occurred. But there wasn't one. German command paralysis by mid-morning. The German response network had collapsed under its own rigidity. Local commanders hesitated, unsure whether to counterattack, hold ground, or reinforce coastal defenses. Higher headquarters demanded accurate reports before authorizing action, but no accurate reports existed. Messages contradicted one another. Paratroopers near Carentan, paratroopers in the marshes, paratroopers heading toward Valognes. Enemy has seized the murder at crossing. Every call added new layers of confusion. Meanwhile, the Americans were making themselves a bigger problem with every passing minute. They controlled Utah Beach's exits. They held Saint-Mère-Église. They formed defensive rings around key objectives, sometimes with as few as 10 men, and stopped multiple German counterattacks before they could threaten the beaches. The Germans realized the truth by the afternoon. Several German officers reached a devastating conclusion. The airborne invasion in darkness had shattered their ability to coordinate the defense of Normandy. Their troops were fighting multiple engagements with no clear picture of enemy strength. Their reserves were moving in circles, blocked by ambushes or misinformation. Their artillery was firing at shadows. Their night fighter units arrived too late to intercept the American transports. And the worst blow to German morale came from captured officers who were interrogated later that day. Many admitted that they had never trained to counter a large-scale airborne assault. Delivered in total darkness. Their doctrine expected clarity. Their defenses expected visibility. Their leadership expected predictability. The Americans had given them none of these. Instead, the night had turned into a battlefield where German advantages evaporated, and American adaptability triumphed as the battle expanded across Normandy. The implications of the nighttime airborne assault became clear to both sides. What began as a chaotic, disorienting drop evolved into one of the most strategically decisive actions of D-Day. German officers, now fully aware of what the darkness had concealed from them, struggled to contain a crisis that had already outrun their ability to react. The long-term impact on the Normandy campaign. German 7th Army faced a disastrous reality. The American Airborne Divisions had severed critical arteries of movement. Roads that should have channeled rapid counterattacks toward Utah Beach became choke points patrolled by small but determined paratrooper groups. Bridges that could have supported armored thrust were already under American control. Communications remained crippled, preventing German units from coordinating even basic maneuvers. This paralysis allowed the U.S. 4th Infantry Division to move inland from Utah Beach with minimal resistance. Unlike Omaha, where German defenses held firm for hours, Utah succeeded largely because airborne troops neutralized German counterattacks. Long before they reached the beaches. By June 7, the Germans understood that the nighttime drops had fundamentally altered the battle's tempo. Instead of a concentrated enemy force they could repel, they faced hundreds of aggressive, unpredictable American pockets scattered across miles of terrain, each one disrupting their logistical lifelines. German post-war reflection, shock at American execution after the war. German officers repeatedly expressed astonishment at the airborne operation. Many described the drops as chaotic brilliant, a paradox wherein the American ability to adapt exceeded anything they had anticipated. General Gunther Blumentritt later stated bluntly, "Their landings in darkness created confusion not only among our troops, but in our command. We lost control in the early hours, and never regained it." Others admitted they had believed nighttime airborne assaults on such scale to be impossible. They assumed allied aircraft would require visibility to coordinate drops. They assumed paratroopers would be helpless if scattered. They assumed darkness would hinder, not empower, the invaders. Every assumption proved false. Lessons for future warfare. Normandy airborne drops reshaped military thinking across the world. Armies studying the campaign recognized several key truths. Adaptability outperforms rigid doctrine. Small autonomous units can paralyze larger forces when communication collapses. Night operations amplify psychological shock far beyond physical effect. Unconventional methods, even disorganized ones, can overwhelm well-prepared defenders. Control of the darkness can equal control of the battlefield. These lessons influenced airborne operations in Korea, Vietnam, and modern rapid insertion tactics used by special forces. A final blow to German morale would be the time Allied armor and infantry pushed inland. The German defenders were fighting a battle they had already psychologically lost. The nighttime infiltration had convinced many that the Americans were everywhere. Even when they mounted counterattacks, they were often hesitant, slow, or misdirected. The Germans would continue to fight with determination. But the shock of that first night, the invisible aircraft, the silent landing, the scattered ambushes, lingered like a wound no reinforcement could heal. The darkness had been conquered, and with it, German hopes for containing the invasion. Night has always carried a kind of ancient power on the battlefield. It narrows vision, heightens instinct, and reduces even the strongest armies to silhouettes and whispers. But on June 6, 1944, the night over Normandy became something more. It became a dividing line between two ways of fighting war, one bound by rigid doctrine and expectation, the other defined by improvisation, adaptability, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. The German officers who watched American paratroopers descend into darkness faced more than a military setback. They confronted a revelation. The enemy they believed they understood was capable of waging war in ways they had never trained for. The Americans did not need perfect conditions. They did not need precision landings. What they needed was initiative, the ability to turn confusion into opportunity, and darkness into an ally. For the paratroopers themselves, the night jump into Normandy became a defining moment in the history of airborne warfare. They stepped into a void with no assurance of landing among friends, no guarantee of survival, and no clear sense of where they were. Yet their courage, their training, and their ability to act independently transformed what could have been disaster into decisive advantage. Their scattered footprints formed a pattern the Germans could not decipher, and that very chaos helped secure the beaches below. And for history, the lesson endures. Innovation in war rarely comes from perfection. It comes from daring, from taking risks that appear reckless, until they redefine what is possible. The nighttime airborne landings of D-Day demonstrated that uncertainty can itself become a weapon, one capable of crippling even the most disciplined defenses. In the darkness over Normandy, the Allies seized not just territory, but initiative. And from that moment forward, the German defense of France was already unraveling.